thank all of you for being here. We made the necessary switch so nobody had to trudge out through the snow and risk life and limb. Thank God for 21st century technology. I'm Richard Fulton. I was for many years with the American Jewish Committee. AJC is one of the sponsors of this program, together with AAJLJ, which is the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, the Greater Washington JCRC, the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, Tzedek DC, and our new co-sponsor, the Jewish Policy Center, and so which I would like to acknowledge and thank them for joining in that. So as I say, I was for many years with AJC. I'm no longer representing them or with them. I am, however, a fellow for religious freedom at the Freedom Forum, which used to be attached to the late lamented museum on Pennsylvania Avenue, but happily continues its work on educating about the First Amendment in other quarters. I'm going to introduce in a moment our guest speaker, Ilya Shapiro. But first, let me ask, first of all, you've all been placed on mute. At the end of the program, at the end of Ilya's remarks in chief, we will be glad to take questions. Just simply indicate on the reactions button that you have a question. Raise your hand there, and we'll be glad to turn to you. I have no doubt, knowing the history of this group, that there'll be many questions. This forum, I should say, is called the Brown Bag Lunch. It is sometimes it's an actual brown bag lunch of people gathered around a table. Post-COVID, it's sort of been a hybrid function where that takes place on Zoom and in person. Today, we're only meeting in person. I mean, in Zoom, and it's directed at Jewish Washington lawyers. But we welcome non-Jews, we welcome non-lawyers, we welcome any interested people who want to hear about whatever the topic of the day is. And today the topic, well, first let me introduce our speaker. Ilya Shapiro is Director of Constitutional Studies at the Manhattan Institute. He is a Senior Fellow and Director as well at the Institute. He's had a series of important and distinguished positions before that. Previously, he was Executive Director and Senior Lecturer at the Georgetown Center for the Constitution. And before that was Vice President of the Cato Institute and Director of Cato's Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies. It is the author of Canceling Justice, the Illiberal Takeover of Legal Education, and Supreme Disorder, Judicial Nominations and the Politics of America's Highest Court. He's been a co-author, an editor, and so forth. Holds an AB from Princeton University, an MSc from the London School of Economics, and a JD from the University of Chicago Law School. So, and I might mention, I recently saw a program in which Ilya spoke together with Nadine Strassen about some of the issues we're going to hear about today. And what was interesting to me was how much common ground there was between them on some of the issues that we all are wrestling with today. So today's topic is anti-Semitism, free speech, and the crisis of higher education. And I don't think you have been paying much attention to what's been going on in the world to know that this is one of the most timely and disturbing topics that are presented in these days. What are the limits of free speech? How should free speech, whether on campuses or off for that matter, deal with expressions of hate that is both respectful of protecting people from harassment and discrimination, and on the other hand, protect one of our most important freedoms, which is to speak freely even about things that other people may find very distasteful. And of course, one of the places where that crisis is playing out most, or that issue is playing out most clearly, is in institutions of higher education, some of which have suddenly discovered that they are free speech absolutists when it comes to hateful speech directed at Jews, but seem not to have been so concerned about that when other speech was taking place that made other minority groups feel unsafe or disadvantaged in some way. So to help us understand these complexities and where we should be going from here, I'd like to turn over the microphone to Ilya Shapiro. Looking forward to your remarks, Ilya.
Great. Well, thanks very much. It's good to be with you all. I wish I could have met you, some of you in person. I've had some involvement in the past before I had little kids with Federation and a couple other communal organizations. But anyway, I hope this is the beginning of my further involvement with some of your member organizations. These are important issues. The October 7th massacre revealed big problems with our institutions of higher education, particularly the so-called elite ones. This is a topic of national debate. A lot of people's eyes have been opened, scales fallen from those eyes. A lot of people are wrestling with previous commitments they had, previous alliances they had. We kind of have a shifting and an inflection point for a lot of debates that we've been having about campus issues and more broadly. It's amazing that the heart of anti-Semitism in America seems to lie on campus among the most educated and progressive people in the country. And yet that's where calls for the annihilation of Israel began, even before the IDF went into Gaza, which has exposed the deep rot in academia. As Bill Ackman put it in a revelatory essay the day Harvard President Claudine Gay resigned, anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine, a warning about larger issues. This oldest hatred is always a leading indicator of assorted underlying pathologies. And in this case, that means everything from cancel culture to ideological indoctrination, intellectual corruption, plagiarism, to moral decay. We've seen a subversion of the core mission of universities to seek truth and develop human knowledge, and of classical liberal values like free speech, due process, equality under the law. It's been a shift from education to activism. The root cause of anti-Semitism on campus is a noxious postmodern ideology that contends that truth is subjective and must be viewed through lenses of race, gender, and other identity categories, according to some privilege hierarchy. Your rights and freedoms depend on whether you're part of a class that's deemed oppressor or oppressed. There's also a false narrative of decolonization. All of that provides the intellectual bulwark behind the anti-Israel and anti-Jewish machinations. But even anti-Semites have the freedom of speech, and they've taken full advantage of it. Pro-Palestinian groups have harassed and assaulted Jewish students. Protesters have disrupted classes and taken over buildings. Ivy League professors have called Hamas's attack exhilarating and awesome. Students tore down hostage posters. Others chanted slogans like "From the River to the Sea" and "Globalize the Intifada." Those who care about free speech are asking what we should make of the calls to punish Hamas apologists. After all, this is America, where you have the right to say even the vilest things. Yes, many of the same students who on October 6th called for harsh punishment for microaggressions are now chanting for the elimination of the world's only Jewish state. But Americans are entitled to be hypocrites. I would put my free speech bona fides up against anyone. As Richard said, Nadine Strassen, the former head of the ACLU, are quite simpatico on these things, even though an essay that I wrote for the Free Press on these issues were supposed to be a counterpoint to hers. It just depends on what you emphasize and what the particular specifics are beyond the basics of the First Amendment, as I'll get into. I'm a lawyer, and I still recognize that not all speech-related questions can be resolved by invoking the words First Amendment. And I like to think about these issues that have arisen in three buckets. So first, much of what we've seen on campus and beyond is not, in fact, speech, but conduct that's designed specifically to harass, intimidate, and terrorize Jews. Second bucket are exceptions to speech protections under the First Amendment, which university rules largely parallel, even for private schools that aren't directly bound by the First Amendment. And the third bucket is other examples with disruptive speech that can properly be regulated by school rules. So opposing such behavior or disruptive speech, I don't think violates the core constitutional principle that the government can't punish you for expressing your beliefs. So again, the first bucket, conduct, not speech. Beating somebody up, that's called assault. Crowding around someone in a threatening manner, like a group of Harvard students, including an editor of the Harvard Law Review. They did to an Israeli student in early November, I think it was. That's known as the common law crime of menacing. A pattern of actions designed to frighten and harass someone, like forcing the students into the Cooper Union Library while pounding on the doors and windows. That's stalking. Defacing someone's property with spray paint or other slogans is vandalism. Tearing down posters, at least on private property and in most campus settings, is also vandalism. Masking at a protest, also a hallmark at events sponsored by Students for Justice in Palestine, is illegal in many states. It's a remnant of the battle against KKK intimidation. Or here's a fun one that I've discovered: public urination. There were cases where people would urinate on buildings that housed organizations they didn't like. Well, I tell you what, regardless of how expressive that urination or assault or whatever is, whatever the motive is, it's not protected speech. You identify, arrest, prosecute the perpetrators of these various crimes in the campus settings, expel them. Okay, second bucket, speech, but unprotected speech. What about calls for genocide, right? This is what Elise Stefanik asked of the 3 university presidents at the congressional hearing last month. These presidents flubbed the answer because they thought that this was a deposition rather than a public hearing. Now, I'll give you the nuanced legal answer, but in no world should someone in the situation that they were in begin their answer with anything other than calling for genocide or harm to any group is always against our values and often violates our policies. Now, as a matter of law and school regulation, it does depend on the context. So first, a clear case. The Cornell student who posted death threats online and was arrested. Absolutely right. The Supreme Court has held that the Constitution does not protect, quote, those statements where the speaker means to communicate a serious expression of an intent to commit an act of unlawful violence to a particular individual or group of individuals. This is what's known as a true threat. Now, beyond true threats, the First Amendment also doesn't protect the incitement of violence. This came up a bit in discussion of January 6th, right? Did Trump incite violence? Did others? Well, the court has defined that's a pretty high bar. Lawyers know this as the Brandenburg standard. Speech that is, quote, directed at inciting or producing imminent lawless action and likely to incite or produce such action. Now, it's surely been reached in some cases, but not all. For example, there was that rally in Los Angeles where a 69-year-old man with an Israeli flag was killed. Probably there was some incitement of violence there. Or let's say a student rally where a speaker tells people to punch every Jew you see today. That would be incitement of violence. Or targeting a Hillel or a Jewish student dorm specifically. But kind of a group of students just cheering for Hamas in the main square or something is no different than a group of students celebrating the killing of Black people. We can imagine that there would be a different response, perhaps, but offensive or so-called hate speech is constitutionally protected, including giving a racially charged speech to a restless crowd, unless there's, as I quoted the test, a direct call to action. Okay, third bucket. Speech that's protected, and it is speech, not conduct, but still subject to what lawyers call time, place, and manner regulations or restrictions. So, for example, core political speech, right? There's nothing more highly protected by the First Amendment than core political speech. And yet, if I come to your neighborhood in the middle of the night and use a bullhorn to tell you what I really think of Joe Biden and Donald Trump, I can be arrested for disturbing the peace. The same thing goes for breaching the terms of a parade permit or not getting a permit at all and blocking traffic. We've seen that in the news in the last little while, where cities are simply not enforcing the law against these blockades. I think that's dangerous. I think, obviously it disturbs people, it disrupts their lives, causes them to miss flights. Ambulances are, lots of problems and it could spark violence. That's why we have these rules against that. Or on campuses, interruptions of classes and speakers. There's a difference between protest and disruption, as some of us have learned quite personally and directly. Student handbooks spell out that it's fine to hold signs or wear t-shirts, give out pamphlets, hold your own events, or show displeasure with the speaker, but you can't shut down events or disrupt classes or otherwise interfere with university programs, because that would be a heckler's veto, which is another form of censorship. It's not a free speech violation to say, look, these students have reserved this space and you can't just shut them down. That's not free speech, that's disruption. But because of either ideological affinity or administrative weakness and misunderstanding free speech principles, officials have been hesitant to discipline students for this behavior. So it continues. Yasha Mounk, who I encourage you all to read, he has a Substack called Persuasion, which is very interesting. I have a Substack as well called Shapiro's Gavel, by the way, that you're welcome to sign up for. But Yasha Mounk, who is a liberal, nobody would call him a conservative or anything else, but he's fed up with campus illiberalism. He explained on Twitter, on X, a couple of months ago, quote, part of protecting free speech is to punish students who violate the rules that make free speech possible for everyone else. This includes punishing those who violently disrupt talks. It includes punishing those who tear down flyers depicting children kidnapped by Hamas. The answer is not to give up on a culture of free speech on campus. It's to enforce the rules that sustain it in an impartial manner. Now, relatedly, students have taken over buildings threatening to stay until their nebulous demands are met. This is conduct, again, not protected by the First Amendment. The students should be removed and disciplined, including arrest for trespassing, not fed burritos, as they were at Harvard. Liz McGill, the Penn president who resigned after that disastrous hearing, seemed to have learned the wrong lesson. In that video that she made to try to rescue her job in vain, she said, well, we're just too protective of speech at Penn. Maybe we need to reevaluate that and narrow the permissible speech so you can't say bad things about Jews. No, that's not the right lesson to draw from all of this. It's to enforce rules even-handedly and have broad speech protections, but know the difference between speech and conduct, unprotected speech, and time, place, and manner regulations. Well, what about other issues that have arisen? I've just given you the basic rubric, but what about professors celebrating Hamas, right? Can we have this going on in our colleges? Well, professors have the same free speech rights as anyone, but university human resources manuals correctly tell them and administrators not to create hostile educational environments. So it's one thing to write an op-ed or give a speech in the public square. It's another to, as a Stanford lecturer did, ask Jewish students to leave their stuff and go to the back of the room, kind of segregating students in that way. He was rightfully removed from teaching. But there was a Columbia professor, Joseph Massad, who was writing about Hamas's actions, calling them awesome. Again, as long as he's not creating that environment as he's teaching his captive audience in class, that is protected. Extramural speech, as is called. Now, the question is whether someone like that should be hired in the first place or granted tenure. These are different issues. But punishment for extramural speech should not be availed. Speech rights of non-citizens. Many of the students who have participated in these hostile protests, blocking Jews from attending class, for example, are foreign nationals, most notably at MIT, right? There's that third president from the hearing, Sally Kornbluth of MIT, who still hasn't resigned. This is something that is still looming. Now, foreigners can't be punished for speech any more than citizens. They do have speech protections, but there can be repercussions for affiliating with certain groups or calling for violence. So the Immigration and Nationality Act allows the denial and revocation of visas of, quote, any alien who endorses or espouses terrorist activity or persuades others to endorse or espouse terrorist activity or support a terrorist organization. Now, the Biden administration is loath to deport foreign students, but the State Department has confirmed in a letter to Senator Marco Rubio that it can revoke the visas of Hamas supporters. MIT declined to take action, even after warning these students that they were violating university policies, precisely because university officials know that many of the harassers were foreign students who would then be subject to deportation. Well, the school's refusal to act there effectively gives foreigners, but not Americans, the right to harass, intimidate, and vandalize. This action opens up the university to claims under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You've heard perhaps about Title VI, right, which prohibits any entity that receives federal money from discriminating on the basis of race, color, national origin, and which the Department of Education, its Office of Civil Rights, has long understood under both Republican and Democratic administrations to include actual or perceived ancestry, ethnicity, and religion. And so as part of the Biden administration's national strategy on anti-Semitism that was launched last May, OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, issued guidance to remind schools, K-12 and higher ed, of their legal obligations to address complaints of discrimination, harassment, etc., based on Jewish ancestry. So the legal landscape is quite ripe, not just looking at students or protesters, what have you, but against institutions that fail to address very real threats to Jewish students. At Cooper Union, the staffer who locked Jewish students in the library for their own protection. I'm not sure offering Jews a chance to hide in the attic satisfies Title VI. And the Department of Education feels similarly. It announced investigations into many schools, including Cooper Union, but also I count at least 4 Ivy League schools: Columbia, Cornell, Harvard, and Penn. There's been a lawsuit by NYU students against their university for Title VI and also breach of contract. That student handbook is as part of the contract they have with students, for example. There was a complaint filed. Bill Hewitt is on this call at Princeton, my alma mater, over Students for Justice in Palestine's use of the student listserv to spread, quote, malicious, harassing, defamatory content in violation of IT policy. So again, not Title VI necessarily, but it's clear in the university contract. And a major lawsuit was just filed last week, or maybe the week before, against Harvard for all sorts of things like this. So one more question, and I'll soon turn to your questions. But what about Students for Justice in Palestine? I've mentioned this group. What can be done about it? What should be done about it? SJP is the most prominent anti-Israel, many would say anti-Jewish group on college campuses, hundreds of chapters across the United States and Canada. Immediately after October 7th, its national organization celebrated the atrocities and created a toolkit for chapters to use on their individual campuses. And then it has organized countless events at which supporters have celebrated Hamas and called for the elimination of Israel. Well, Brandeis, perhaps unsurprisingly, was the first to withdraw recognition of SJP. Its president wrote in the Boston Globe, quote, chants and social media posts calling for violence against Jews or the annihilation of the state of Israel must not be tolerated. This constitutes a genuine threat or harassment that's otherwise incompatible with the functioning of this university. Other private universities have followed suit, Columbia and GW, for example. The Florida public university system also initially ordered the deactivation of SJP chapters at the behest of Governor DeSantis. And I should note that DeSantis appointed me last fall to the Board of Trustees of Florida Polytechnic University, where there is no SJP chapter. But the chancellor of all of the higher ed university institutions, the public system in Florida, cited the national SJP group's ties to Hamas, writing that it's a felony under Florida and federal law to provide material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization. That move has been paused while they work out some of the legal niceties, but indeed, the Supreme Court has ruled that the government may prohibit even nonviolent material support for terrorism. The key there is the level of coordination, cooperation, direction between the recognized terrorist group and the group that the government is taking action against in the United States. And so the devil is in the details, like it is with incitement and true threats. So I think it's heartening that public officials like here in Virginia, our Attorney General Jason Miyares has launched investigations of assorted nonprofits and potential ties to terrorists. Erwin Chemerinsky, the dean of Berkeley Law, wrote last fall that as a 70-year-old Jewish man, quote, never in my life have I seen or felt the anti-Semitism of the last few weeks. Well, some of us were less surprised given the anti-Israel, anti-American, and generally anti-Western ideology that has taken root in higher education. Much of this has to do, as I said, with this noxious kind of postmodern critical theory that has taken root. in terms of what faculty teaches, but even more importantly, given the dynamic we've seen in the last decade, in terms of the bureaucracy, the DEI structures, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that actually prevent intellectual diversity, exclude those with deviation from progressive orthodoxy, and work against equality of opportunity in favor of equality of outcome. It really subverts the traditional mission of the university for open inquiry, free speech, academic freedom, as well as due process, and equal application of the rules to everyone else. The bureaucracy has just exploded in the last decade, such that now there are, in many places, more non-teaching staff, not just more than faculty, but more than students. A century ago at Yale, each student came with a butler. Well, the joke goes 100 years later, there's so many of these educational bureaucrats, maybe Yale students are all going to get butlers again. But we've gotten to a place where the academic Overton window, the range of permissible policy views, has warped and shifted. And that from that comes cancel culture, from that comes not just visible things that make the national news, but students and professors who feel that they have to walk on eggshells, they can't express themselves, they can't even raise certain or discuss certain controversial issues, let alone take an incorrect position. So what we have really is the illiberal takeover of higher education. This is not the decades-old complaint that conservatives have about liberal professors, the hippies taking over the faculty lounge at Berkeley. Frankly, I don't think the ideological ratio among students or faculty has changed that much since I was in college 25 years ago or law school 20 years ago. But instead, we have weak administrators who placate the radical left. And it's that illiberal left that now drives campus culture. We see this manifest in an assorted ways, but it's really as I mentioned, the revenge or the return of critical theory, whether critical legal studies, critical race theory, or other things that again view the world through these identity lenses, and your rights, your freedoms depend on where you are in the privilege hierarchy. Engaging in that kind of intersectional Olympics, I think, is a losing battle for Jews. It's not, I don't think the strategy now is to say, well, DEI offices, you need to recognize Jews as a minority that needs special protections like you give to everyone else. Instead, I think it's to abolish these DEI structures, still enforce federal and state civil rights laws. That has nothing to do with DEI, make sure there's no discrimination, but remove these trainings and ideological struggle sessions where people are told to confess their racism or other heterodoxies that are unacceptable. Remove diversity statements and other ideological litmus tests for hiring or admissions, and reopen the idea that universities should be a place where ideas are meant to challenge you, where feeling, this perversion of these terms of safety and harassment to mean anything that makes you feel uncomfortable, and getting rid of that it really undermines the traditional university missions for intellectual growth. And to change this, I don't think it's going to happen from within. We need external controls, exogenous shocks, whether that be alumni and donors and trustees, whether that be employers, whether that be state legislators for public institutions, or state attorney general investigations, or congressional oversight tied to federal funding. I testified before the House Education Committee last spring, and there are a lot of strings that are attached to federal funding, be it accounting standards, be it anti-discrimination rules, protection of the freedom of speech and open inquiry, I think needs to be there. Or federal judges, about a dozen of them are boycotting Yale and Stanford for their clerkship hirings until their cultures improve. And media exposure, public exposure. Last February, after the Wall Street Journal published an expose of how Texas Tech used job applicants' diversity statements as litmus tests, the university announced that it would end this practice for faculty hiring. That's all it takes. To mix metaphors, a lot of these situations, which have made me feel a little less pessimistic, I wouldn't go so far as to say optimistic, but a little less pessimistic, has shown a lot of these structures that are in place to be Potemkin villages guarded by paper tigers. But it doesn't take long to destroy reputations built over decades and centuries. The question now is whether universities are willing to do the work, as they say, to restore their tarnished stature. The resignation of Claudine Gay, Harvard's embattled former president, doesn't end that university's troubles. The school is still plagued by toxic campus culture, ideological corruption, bureaucratic bloat, all of which stifle open inquiry and free discourse. And in that, Harvard is by no means alone. Gay is a mediocre scholar from a privileged background who was elevated for advancing progressive orthodoxy while checking the right intersectional boxes. She's the apotheosis of the anti-intellectual movement that values DEI, identity, and activism over truth-seeking, merit, and education. And that movement is designed to prefer political commissars over rigorous scholars. Ironically, these efforts at making students feel welcome have backfired. Campus climate surveys show an inverse correlation between the growth of DEI initiatives and student feelings of belonging, for example. And in its most recent rankings, FIRE, the gold standard, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, named Harvard the absolutely worst school in the country for free speech, the only one earning an abysmal ranking. I think they ranked something like 245 schools. The bottom 5 included, in addition to Harvard, Penn, and Georgetown, all schools in the news for these various controversies. Now, last month, celebrated Harvard professor Steve Pinker, again, not a conservative, laid out a 5-point reform plan, enforcing free speech, institutional neutrality, not pronouncing on every little political controversy that comes your way, although it's a little rich to start that policy after the pogrom of October 7th, enforcing university rules, whether it be against disruption or extortion or what have you, viewpoint diversity, and disempowering DEI. So there's still a long way to go before universities return to their mission of seeking truth and knowledge, and law schools return to their goal of teaching future lawyers to uphold the rule of law. But the battle's been joined. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to answering or dodging what questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Ilya. Really comprehensive and interesting presentation. I'd like to, I as moderator and or chair, I have that great prerogative of asking the first couple of questions, and I'm going to do that. And I sort of want to start where you're ending now. We've moved, and I understand in some views these are irreducibly connected, from the issue of free speech per se to the issue of DEI and these campus structures and the ideology that they ostensibly represent. So the question, so first question, I'll ask a couple and then you can just respond as you see appropriate. First question is, isn't, as you've noted, Harvard and my alma mater, I should say, but I'm not proud of it these days in some respects. Whatever the standards are vis-a-vis free speech and protecting students from harm, etc., they clearly have not applied that standard consistently. And we all recognize that Jewish students were not afforded the same concerns and respect that have been accorded other groups. Isn't it the case that right now, since I don't think DEI is going away tomorrow, right now, the very least we should be demanding is that there be consistency, that if the school is going to adhere to these kinds of standards, then it's got to do that for all minority groups, not least a minority group, a third of which, the population of which was wiped out in living memory, although there are fewer and fewer people for whom it's living memory. So that's something that that I think people, even some people who like DEI in principle, ought to be able to come together with others and say, we need to make that demand. So that's the first question. The second is, and this really has to do with what DEI purports to do. It strikes me that at least in seeking diversity and inclusion on campuses, this is a worthy mission. We don't want campuses in which everybody looks alike, and I think that having campuses where students are selected, for instance, simply on the basis of SAT scores would make for very very poor pedagogical experiences for the students that are attending those schools. So is there a way to think about, maybe rename it if that's what necessary, to think about what schools ought to be doing to protect having a more diverse and inclusive environment, even at the same time that they don't stray into the ideological problems that you have been pointing out. And here, I'll close with this. Miguel Cordano, the Secretary of Education, recently spoke about in responding to concerns about treatment of Jews, and he was very sympathetic to the harm that has been done to Jewish students. He said, we see DEI efforts reduced to just Black and brown issues. And as a Latino, but also as an education leader, I think that's unfortunate. So he's sort of on side on that. He says, we need to look at DEI as a place where conversations about religious identity or difference of opinions could be handled respectfully and civilly, like what I saw today. And he points at Dartmouth's campus, where he thinks they have a really good program of dialogue between people with very diverse points of view. So that's a bundle of things. I wonder if you could respond on.
Sure. So first of all, treating Jews differently and less protected than other minorities, I think that's a point that is being raised in the various Title VI suits that I mentioned and other complaints. I think the ultimate solution isn't to narrow the permissible range of speech, but as University of Chicago, as one of the rare exceptions, has done, the former president Bob Zimmer and a long tradition there. When confronted with these mobs or demands for investigation or punishment, discipline of professors or students who violate some politically correct orthodoxy, he says we're not in the speech police business, and the mob disperses. It doesn't take much, but university officials are generally not, they're spineless cowards. They're not woke radicals or social justice warriors or activists themselves, but they are careerist bureaucrats who learn that the way to climb the greasy ladder is to mollify and placate certain groups, and the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and the left-wing radicals are loud and squeaky, and so it's easier to go that way until very recently, when it's been shown to university officials that there can be a cost. Forget convincing them of the value of free speech or other classical liberal values. Just show them the brute force of cost benefit analysis, whether that be the brand, whether that be donations, whether it be confidence in your leadership or what have you, bad publicity. So in the long term, the solution is not to treat Jews with kid gloves, but to say, look, here are our rules on harassment, here are rules on disruption, here are rules on speech, and we're just going to enforce that. And I don't care if someone's racist or whatever. That's not my job to tell them that they're a bad person. That's, speak with them, write with them, argue with them, what have you. But here are our rules, and we're going to enforce them. In the rare places where those kinds of rules are enforced, there's a vibrant discourse going on. And presidents, deans, department chairs are quite good at instilling whatever values they like, whether that be entrepreneurship, public service, giving back to the community, social justice, whatever they care about. So free speech and open inquiry needs to be that, and toughening your hide, and when someone says something that offends you, unless again you go through that analysis that I gave, that's not up to the university to police. On your second question, I think you're conflating DEI and affirmative action, or kind of the dictionary objective definition of diversity and inclusion versus what DEI is. Because everybody makes this mistake who's not professionally working in this area. Bill Ackman wrote a big essay the day that Claudine Gay resigned, that was then reprinted on the Free Press, that talked about how he had no idea what DEI was all about. That he thought it was diversity. Who's against having lots of different perspectives and backgrounds? That only enriches the experience. Who can disagree with that? Equity, fairness, right? You want to be fair, treat everyone fairly. Or and we're lawyers in the legal context, equity, right? The equity courts, that's justice. Who can be against that? Inclusion. You want people to feel welcome, included, like they're a valuable member of the community, or, whether you're an employer or a school or whatever else. Who can object to these anodyne, salutary words, right? But in practice, that's not it. In practice, it's essentially 180 degrees from what it is. And to the extent that we want to make sure that people have access to institutions, have a fair shake at applying, and that we're considering, the whole breadth of people's talents and experiences, I think that's all to the good. But it shouldn't be reduced to someone's identity. Tell me something interesting. Tell me, there's lots of, the elite schools especially, what affirmative action as practiced, what racial preferences, identity preferences has led to, is a lot of, rich minority kids, well, certain minorities, not all, whichever ones are politically preferred at a given time. I'm not sure that's, who all think the same, by the way. I'm not sure that's exactly what if we're serious about the objective dictionary definitions of DEI, I'm not sure that that's what we want.
Thanks so much for that response. We do have several hands up, and I'd like to first call on the host today of a virtual meeting, but nevertheless usually our host, Harvey Ryder, to ask his question. Please, Harvey.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, virtual host. I didn't have to give you a sandwich today. Ilya, I understand your concerns, and there's a lot to criticize about the number of DEI programs, but I don't think that can account for all of the anti-Semitism you see on campuses. I wonder how much of it could be really attributable to just the force of disinformation. We see it with people, who still believe the 2020 election was stolen, or you can find 100,000 people in the United States who think that the earth is flat. Some of it, disinformation spreads like wildfire, and it's hard to erase. How else, can you account for the fact that educated students think that Israel was colonized by Jews in 1948, when half the population of the Jewish population of Israel is Sephardic?
Well, I don't know what disinformation is. I'm certainly wary of allowing any government officials of deciding what's true or not. We've seen under COVID some of the negative effects of what that leads to. Rather than disinformation, I would just say bad education or maleducation. What people are taught. Some of this is foreign.
They're not all taught that. Some of them are engineering students out protesting. They're nursing students. They're not really. That's not their curriculum, and they don't even.
Yeah, but I don't think it's that they're. Well, if you're talking about that they're on TikTok or other social media, and kind of the algorithms. If you see one thing, it shows you more and more, and goes down a rabbit hole of whatever you might be into, whether that's crocheting or Jew hatred, right? I think there's something to that. And there's also something to, a lot of foreign students in other countries, Muslim majority or otherwise, that are taught anti-Semitism from the cradle, and they bring that. And funding of these universities by Qatar and other anti-Semitic institutions, I think, is a problem. But disinformation, misinformation, I'd rather call it bad education or exposure to the wrong things or what have you. But a lot of times whether from the left or the right, people are criticizing disinformation and misinformation. They want the government to step in and say, okay, well, this is the truth, and we're going to suppress this or something like that. And I think that solution is worse than the problem.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to turn now to Marshall Breger, who has his hand up as well.
You're still muted, Marshall. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So first, hello. And I certainly agree with your general critique of the corrosion of the mission of the university. We live in the world of identity politics, not the search for truth. And it's obvious the level of hypocrisy is staggering, although I'm not sure we should base our public policy on Schadenfreude. But I want to walk you back to free speech, because you're certainly, I believe, correct that punching people, tearing down posters, these are all, and even maybe marching without a permit, although the question is if the permit process is fair to everyone, are all things that are actionable and should be actionable. But many Jewish groups, Richard could speak for the AJC, but I believe the ADL and others say people in the campus square shouting "River to the Sea" should be punished because the Jewish students feel afraid, unsafe, not comfortable. So I just want to be clear from what you talked about in terms of speech. If it's an opinion, River to the Sea, Free Palestine, to which there was an interesting report where a Jewish student said, I can't go to class because the girl behind me on her laptop says Free Palestine, resist. And that makes me feel uncomfortable. If what your view would be as to that this speech would be licit, or the question may be, what does harassment mean? What is my right to be comfortable? Is it my right to be emotionally safe at the university? You obviously have a right to be physically safe, but I just want to walk back to the question.
There are legal standards in all of this. I'm not an employment lawyer or an education lawyer. The standards are somewhat similar in those environments. Severe and pervasive is one of the terms of art about what harassment has to be to establish a hostile work or educational environment. Having, I think, a sticker on a laptop isn't enough. It depends on whether they're, crowding around a particular student, targeting them. There's well-developed jurisprudence about the definition of harassment or stalking or menacing. These, for that matter, assault, right? You don't have to touch someone to commit assault. It's as we learned in 1L, it's causing an apprehension of a justified fear of violence or what have you. So the different schools have different rules in their handbooks. This is all well defined, and it's very fact specific. But you don't get to be an eggshell plaintiff, as it were. You don't like someone's T-shirt. Tough. Now, if they're again, if they're in your face yelling these eliminationist slogans, or if the university policy says, you can't, harassment is defined as a gathering of a lot of people shouting things that are, however you define it. We're lawyers. You got to look at the text and how it's been applied, for that matter, the common law of the university disciplinary authorities, as it were. And you can have breach of contract actions if something is different in a particular case, things like that. But I can't give you a black and white answer, but that's how I'd start issue spotting the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. I next see Edward Shapiro has his hand up. Please, Ed, ask your question.
Hi, Ilya. Ed Shapiro. Good to see you. There was a lot of momentum when Liz McGill and then Claudine Gay were ousted. And there seems to have been a little bit of a pause in the intensity, which I suppose is understandable. But where do you think strategy and tactics go from here in terms of keeping pressure on higher education to change? What do you think are the most strategies and mechanisms most likely to be successful?
I think we need an all of the above strategy. You never know what pressure point is gonna work at what time. We are certainly in this follow ground for potential change, and that window will close at a certain point. Bill Ackman, all of a sudden, it doesn't hurt to have a billionaire who is, now it's his hobby horse to achieve reform, at least at his alma mater, if not higher ed more broadly. My colleague Chris Rufo, has this model of activism. There's lots of enterprising, muckraking journalists who are looking at all sorts of things, not just plagiarism of university leaders, but all sorts of things. So it's going to take all kinds of pressure. Last year, I think 5 states passed some version of anti-DEI or diversity statements or diversity training legislation, as well as some executive orders. We've now in a new year of legislative sessions in most states. Some more are picking that up. I have model legislation with Chris that we put out a year ago in that vein. Trustees, I think, is an important point. ACTA, the American College of Trustees and Alumni, is ramping up its activities. The problem is trustees generally go along to get along. They like the prestige, such as it is, of being on their college board, the nostalgia coming back for homecoming, and for that matter, getting access to the good football and basketball tickets. And regardless of how they vote, whether they're nominally Republican, Democrat, whatever, they don't want to make waves. They don't want to do the work, as it were, because as I'm learning in my trusteeship at Florida Poly, you got to go through the mundane stuff of financial records and facilities reports, all these stuff that you to be a good fiduciary. And I think the model of what makes for a good trustee is changing. A number of governors for public institutions, DeSantis, Youngkin here in Virginia, Abbott, some others are starting to appoint people, not just who are politically aligned, but who are going to look under the hood and hold the feet of the university officials to the fire. And a similar dynamic, I think we're seeing in the private sector with the private universities. Mark Rowan of Wharton and other Penn alums are putting a lot of pressure. We'll see if this insurgent campaign for Harvard overseers, which is a separate board from the Harvard Corporation that was involved in the Claudine Gay day-to-day plagiarism stuff. We're in the eye of the storm for all of these things, but all of these pressure points are definitely worth pursuing.
And I see that Russell Bickoff, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, also has a question. Russell, please
Hi.
go ahead.
Thanks a lot. Russ Bykoff. Hi, Ilya. I went to the University of Michigan in the 1960s into the mid-70s for college and law school. I sent my 3 sons to Indiana University, and we've seen a lot of anti-Israel agitation and anti-Semitism on both of those campuses, but it's been under control until recently, until October 7th and the aftermath, when things seem to have gone off the rails. So I wonder if the best strategy for people who care about Israel and about Jewish students on campus and the Jewish community in this country more generally is to just focus on those issues and not so much the broader ideological landscape that you sketched out. I never thought I would applaud anything that Elise, I think that's her name, Elise Stefanik, did on Capitol Hill. She's not my idea of a very effective representative from New York, where I'm from, originally. So let me ask, is there a better strategy to kind of put the current problems back in a more manageable box today, the way they were before October 7th? And I also want to observe that civil lawsuits are probably necessary, but they take forever, as we who litigate know. Criminal prosecutions are faster and more effective, and I'm very familiar with those on both the prosecution and defense side. I'm surprised there haven't been more on our campuses. And finally, I will note that I suspect that there are many more threatening masked Palestinians on campus today than there were in my day, when it would be, they might be lucky to get 20 or 25 graduate students from the Arab world on a parade through the Michigan campus. But today there are probably many, many more. And I can understand, although I'm not personally aware of how the Jewish students may feel on these campuses today.
Well, look, I don't know if, we've talked here about various strategies policies that can be pursued. I don't want to repeat myself on that. If your question boils down to, do you have to pursue broader structural change to make Jews feel more comfortable on campus? I think the answer is yes, because I think it's all connected. And as Ackman noted, Jews are the canary. They're we're always the tip of the spear that, when there are underlying pathologies in the culture that expresses itself as Jew hatred before the rest of society falls apart. Michigan is, I have this book coming out. The title has changed since what was in my bio. It's no longer Canceling Justice. It's now Lawless, the Miseducation of America's Future Leaders. And it's going to come out the day after Labor Day. So back to school time, I guess. But for University of Michigan, there are now 261 full-time people responsible for DEI, about double that when you consider those who are partially responsible, part-time, part of their responsibilities, a total cost of more than $30 million. I think that's more than anywhere else at this point in the entire country. Michigan's obviously a big school, but I think that's more than anyone else. And imagine how many scholarships you could give for that money, or whatever other uses of that money, because the analyses that I've read and in doing my own research, these DEI structures are value subtracting in terms of on their own merits, making people feel included, promoting race relations, all the rest of it. In fact, they're resegregating campuses, if anything. So I don't think we can avoid these larger fights. October 7th has made the scales fall from a lot of people's eyes and made people pay attention that otherwise would think, oh, this is all this, extreme left, extreme right. I don't have to pay attention. I just can keep my head down, do my own thing, worry about my family, my job, what have you. And I don't think that's the case in a lot of places. Now it's at the level of the highest national politics, when it's all boiled down to Trump versus Biden, that's kind of hard to figure into. But at all these other dimensions, with pressure on trustees, on governors, state legislators, and everything else, I think there's room for movement.
Thanks, Ilya.
Thank you. We're running down, but I'd like to ask what probably is going to be the last question. Ilya, as I'm sure you're well aware, the issue of anti-Semitism on campus, Jewish students being marginalized, is nothing new. It didn't start on October 7th. And one of the ways that has manifested has been cases like at one campus where a woman who had been involved in founding a club that was dedicated to providing assistance to and support for women who had been victims of sexual violence, was herself kicked out of that club because she had the temerity at one point to post on social media that she supported the existence of the state of Israel. Never mind any specific policy. The very existence of the state of Israel was enough to get her kicked out of that club. And similarly, at Berkeley, there's a number of clubs that adopted a policy that they wouldn't allow anybody who was a Zionist to speak to any of those clubs, even if the topic had nothing to do with Zionism, just the fact, again, their identity as being part of the probably 80 to 90% of Jews that support the existence of the state of Israel was enough to deny them a role. So no less than Erwin Chemerinsky, the dean of Berkeley School, has said, on the one hand, A, he's a Zionist, B, he thinks it's an offensive standard, but C, that this kind of thing is protected by free speech and freedom of assembly of these clubs, notwithstanding that they are clubs operating under the auspices and with funding from the school. So if we can't deal with that, I mean, this really has set the
Yeah,
groundwork.
I
for the
think
legitimate- So I wanted to ask you for your view of all
yeah, I
this.
think Irwin's wrong on that.
Yeah.
And he's kind of cagey in a lot of different ways, and I think struggling with cognitive dissonance after October 7th, which was, of course, a year after these Berkeley clubs came out with their anti-Zionist statement. Because, Berkeley, as you said, is a state institution, and they have an all-comers policy, which means, Democrats can't reject Republicans, and vice versa. All these different things. Now, if you're saying, well, these clubs have to accept Jews as members, but they're not allowed to speak. I don't know. That's slicing it a little thinly. I'm not sure that's right. Or if you're saying, well, they can be members as long as they're not pro-Israel. Is that kind of like saying, you can have Chinese members as long as they're not pro-Taiwan or something? I mean, but even more fundamentally, because I think Zionism and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are you can't separate them. Anyway, there's a great online debate between Irwin and Ken Marcus, who is the head of the Office of Civil Rights in both the Bush and Trump administration, now runs the Brandeis Center and has been filing a lot of these lawsuits against schools on that particular point. It is deeply embedded, and a lot of these people that end up running these non-teaching centers at schools go through DEI style training when they get their professional training for their cultural centers and things like that. And part of that boils down to that oppressor-oppressed thing, and Israel's the colonizer, and yada yada. So it's a huge problem, and if university leaders were more engaged in making sure that those kind of illiberal policies weren't taking place, then Jews and everyone else would be a lot better off. There's a question I wanted to address. A couple of things that came up on the chat or the Q&A. On the chat, there was a question about revoking 501c3 status. That's tax exemptions. That's interesting. There are standards for what can lose you your C3 status. There's also a roiling political debate about whether higher ed institutions, particularly very wealthy ones, the Ivy League, deserve to be tax exempt in the first place. It's being investigated. It's a rather high bar. The famous case is Bob Jones University, which wasn't allowing interracial dating, and the Supreme Court said that the IRS could revoke its tax exempt status for that. But there's a pretty high bar for that sort of thing. And then there's a comment on Bill Hewitt asks about my assessment of Princeton. Better than Harvard and Penn, but that's an exceedingly low bar, or Columbia. Princeton historically has had less activism and less radicalism than these other schools, but again, a low bar. There have been students that have been blocked. There have been shoved, I think, in one case. The eliminationist chants and all of that. President Eisgruber is trying to have it both ways and says he's taking everything seriously. This complaint that's been filed on this very technical matter, which is interesting, about the misuse of the university IT, student listserv, what have you. I looked at the complaint and it seems meritorious to me, but no action yet by the relevant council a month later. We'll see. I mean, Eisgruber is lucky that he wasn't asked to appear at that hearing along with the three other presidents. Whoever gave the Columbia president advice and to beg off and say I have a schedule conflict, deserves a doubling of their salary, because I think all of those kind of university presidents, short of University of Chicago's, would have essentially done the same thing. And it's not because Wilmer Hale misadvised them. I really don't think that's the case. I think they just have a lack of moral leadership, and they're always in their bubbles, and they never meet someone who has a different worldview, and just can't comprehend the the nature of the moment that we're in.
Great. So I think we're at our time. And thank you, Ilya, for spotting those questions. I guess I should have done so. So first of all, I want to thank you very much, Ilya Shapiro of the Manhattan Institute, for spending time with us and providing us with a very rich and interesting response to the problems of anti-Semitism, free speech, and the crisis on America's campuses. So thank you for that. I will just mention in closing, because there's no end of things to be discussed on these issues, that tomorrow at 12 noon Eastern Time, the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice is sponsoring a webinar on the topic of how to be an anti-Semite, which will inevitably deal with some of the issues that we've talked about today. And anyone who wants further information on that, please be in touch and I'll get that to you. So again, thanks all of you for participating in this program. Thanks to our co-sponsors, and look forward to you joining us for another one in our series of Brown Bag Lunches. Thank you.